Okay, hey guys, welcome back to the channel. So today we'll talk about chapter 9, which is the gas exchange system, and we'll talk about the consequences of smoking. So we'll begin off with what the structure of the gas exchange system is. Then we'll talk about the features of the gas exchange system and their what role and what function they play. And then we'll continue with how smoking affects our gas exchange system, and then we'll end off with some questions as usual. So let's begin. So we know that for air to enter our gas exchange system, it must enter through the mouth or the nose, and it will be carried through the lungs via the trachea. So the trachea is this long structure over here. So air will enter through the mouth and nose, and then it will enter the trachea. And the trachea, it will divide into two, so it can supply air to two lungs. So we have two lungs, so it must divide into two. It will divide into something called a bronchus or bronchi, and then the bronchi will subdivide and branch extensively to form bronchial tree. So what happens is the bronchial tree is formed as the bronchus will subdivide and branch extensively, and this forms smaller bronchioles, and then the smaller bronchioles will also divide to form terminal bronchioles, and terminal bronchioles will also further divide to form respiratory bronchioles. And these respiratory bronchioles are the ones that supply these tiny air sacs, which we know as alveoli, with air, and alveoli the site of gas exchange. So the lungs are also surrounded by a two-layered membranal structure around here. So these pleural membranes, they enclose airtight space, and they contain a fluid which enable like friction-free movement during expansion and contraction of the cavity. So it allows the lungs to expand and contract during inspiration and expiration. So the first part we talk about is the trachea. So the trachea and bronchi, they contain something called cartilage, and cartilage appears in these two structures in different forms. So in the trachea, it contains regular arrangement of C-shaped rings. So the cartilage are arranged or look like or have a shape of a C shape. Bronchi, they contain irregular blocks or chunks of cartilage. So the cartilage allows the bronchi and trachea to basically remain open at all times, and also it prevents them from collapsing and bursting, and allows them to resist air pressure changes during inspiration and expiration or during breathing. Cilia is also present along bronchi, bronchioles, and trachea, and cilia are just extensions of cells, which I guess you could say they beat up, like move around front and back, and we call this like continued beating of the cilia, and this helps to carry mucus upwards and towards the top of the trachea, where the mucus will be swallowed, and once you swallow it, it will go into the stomach, and it will be destroyed by the hydrochloric acid which is present in the stomach, and the mucus helps to trap foreign particles and pathogens, so this will be destroyed in the stomach. So mucus glands and goblet cells, they are present along the epithelium of the bronchi, bronchioles, and trachea. So mucus glands, they produce mucin. Mucin is a glycoprotein, and it has many carbohydrate chains which is attached to it, and they can absorb water, and they form a sticky substance that we know as mucus. So when goblet cells secrete mucus, it can help to trap foreign particles and pathogens which have entered along with air, and it prevents us from entering and settling in our respiratory systems. So there's also smooth muscle which is found in walls of trachea, bronchi, and bronchioles. But specifically in the bronchiole, they can contract and relax to adjust the diameter of the airways. So this can increase or decrease airflow into the alveoli. And there's an absence of cartilage in the bronchiole, so it allows for these adjustments to be made. And lastly, there's elastic fibers. And elastic fibers are found in alveolar walls. And this allows the alveoli to stretch and recoil, stretch during inspiration and recoil during expiration. So during inspiration, the elasticity will allow the alveoli to expand. So this increases the surface area for diffusion to occur. So again, this helps to increase efficiency of gas exchange. And in expiration, since it recoils back into its smaller shape, this will reduce the volume of the alveoli by expelling all the air efficiently, and helps to maintain the concentration gradient between the alveolar air and the blood plasma. So now we'll talk about the gas exchange in the alveoli. So we know that the alveolar air contains air which has high concentration of oxygen but low concentration of carbon dioxide, because this is the air which we have breathed in. But the blood which is brought to the alveoli, it has a higher concentration of CO2 and a low concentration of oxygen. So it's the deoxygenated blood which is brought to the lungs by the pulmonary artery, and the pulmonary vein carries it back to the heart. So we'll cover this in the heart chapter, but so just know that the pulmonary artery brings blood to the lungs and pulmonary vein takes it away. So oxygen will basically first dissolve in this thin film of moisture which is present along the inner alveolar wall. It dissolves in the alveolar wall so that diffusion can occur faster, and it'll then diffuse down a concentration gradient. So we know that the alveolar air has a higher concentration gradient and the blood plasma has a lower concentration gradient. So it will diffuse through the one cell thick squamous epithelium. So the alveoli are made by squamous epithelium. So it will diffuse to the one cell thick squamous epithelium. And the blood capillary wall is also one cell thick, so it will diffuse to that as well. And it will enter the blood plasma. The carbon dioxide will do the opposite. It will diffuse to the one cell thick blood capillary endothelium and then into the through the one cell thick squamous epithelium of the alveoli, and then enter the alveolar cavity. So, okay, this is what I just explained. So what happens is the oxygenated blood is brought by pulmonary artery. So this means that it has a lower concentration of oxygen and higher concentration of CO2 because oxygen is distributed throughout the body, and now it's being brought back for being oxygenated or resupplied. So what happens is this will travel, the red blood cells will travel down here, and it already contains the oxygen and CO2. It's some of them in the blood plasma. So what will happen is the oxygen it will diffuse in and CO2 will diffuse out, and then it will basically leave. So the oxygenated blood, which means that the blood is now containing more oxygen or saturated with oxygen, it's carried by the pulmonary vein back to the heart. And the CO2 diffuses into the alveolar cavity. So let's talk about how the alveoli is adapted for gas exchange. So we know that the wall of the alveoli, which is of squamous epithelium cells, they're only one cell thick, so it reduces the diffusion distance, so it increases the rate of gas exchange. So alveoli itself exists as numerous clusters. So there's large surface area to volume ratio for gas exchange. It contains elastic fiber, so it basically can expand during inspiration and recoil. So this also helps to maintain the concentration gradient. There's a thin film of moisture on the inner alveolar wall. This allows gases to have a faster rate of diffusion. And there's also a network of blood capillaries surrounding the alveolar sac. So this always supplies the alveoli with blood, so it helps to maintain the concentration gradient as well. And the proximity of the alveolar epithelium to the capillary endothelium, it's very close. So there's also rapid rate of diffusion because there's a shorter diffusion distance between that. And okay, so I think there's a repetition of slides here, so we just do this. And now let's just have a recap of the distribution of features. So the trachea, it contains cartilage, C-shaped rings, it contains goblet cells, smooth muscle, it contains mucous glands and cilia. Bronchus contains cartilage. The irregular chunks or blocks of cartilage contain goblet cells, smooth muscle, and cilia. Terminal bronchiole will only contain smooth muscle and cilia. It will not contain cartilage, and same for respiratory bronchiole, but it will contain lesser cilia. And alveoli, it doesn't contain any of this. It is only made of squamous epithelium, and it is the site of gas exchange. So now let's just talk about the immediate or acute short-term effects of cigarette smoke on our body. So cigarette smoke contains nicotine and carbon monoxide. So this is meant to be monoxide, but yeah, so nicotine. So first of all, nicotine is what causes cigarettes to become very addictive. So it has a highly addictive drug because it can stimulate the nerve endings in the brain to release a transmitter substance, which we know as dopamine. And it helps to, dopamine is involved in associating or reinforcing, it's associated with reinforcing pleasurable experiences. Nicotine also causes the nervous system to reduce the diameter of arteriole and releases adrenaline from adrenal gland. It increases the heart rate, the blood pressure, and it also increases the risk of blood clots, and it also decreases blood supply to extremities. Carbon monoxide, so this is not meant to be monoxide, not carbon dioxide. Just take a note. So carbon monoxide can bind irreversibly hemoglobin, which means that this reaction is irreversible. It cannot be converted back to obtain hemoglobin again. So it forms carboxyhemoglobin, and carboxyhemoglobin is a stable compound. And carbon monoxide has a higher affinity for hemoglobin than oxygen, so it is preferred. It's more likely to bind if it's present in the body. So what happens is the red blood cell will not be fully oxygenated anymore. So lesser oxygen will be supplied to the heart muscle or throughout the body. So there might be a strain on the muscle during exercise. It also damages the endothelium lining of the arteries. So this is related to atherosclerosis, which is when if you damage the endothelium, it's easier for depositing fat molecules into the arterial wall, which can clog the coronary arteries. I think we've learned this in our previous syllabus, so I won't talk about that too much here. So what happens is it increases the chances of fat molecules to be deposited into the arterial wall and increases the risk of coronary heart disease. So they work together because this increases the risk of blood clots, and the blood clots can also clog the coronary arteries along with the deposits of the fat molecules on the arterial walls. And next thing we'll talk about is chronic bronchitis, and chronic bronchitis usually goes hand in hand with emphysema. So we'll talk about chronic bronchitis first, and then we'll talk about emphysema, and I think finally it's about lung cancer. So the signs and symptoms of chronic bronchitis is there's a lot of cough, which is to remove the obstructions of the airways which is present. There's also persistent infection because bacteria and virus can accumulate in the mucus which are stuck the airways, and there's also large quantities of phlegm spat out. So chronic bronchitis is basically the damage and obstruction of the airways. So it starts off because of tar, and tar is present in the cigarette smoke. So what happens is tar stimulates and enlarges goblet cells and mucus glands. So it increases the secretion of mucus, and at the same time it inhibits the cleaning action from ciliated epithelium. So what happens is the ciliated epithelium is either destroyed or the sweeping action itself is weakened. So obviously the mucus will not be removed and it will accumulate in the airways. So the airways will be obstructed. In the bronchioles, for instance, you can be in any of the airways. So what will happen is this will cause dirt, bacteria, viruses, for example, to collect. This leads to an infection, and then this will attract white blood cells to the site of infection. This will also cause further blockage of the airway, and persistent infection will damage the epithelium. So there'll be a replacement with scar tissue, and the scar tissue will cause the airways to become further narrow, and tissue and smooth muscle surrounding the bronchiole and bronchi will become thicker eventually, and this will cause the airways to even become further narrower. And infections can cause the lining to become inflamed, and this also usually causes the airways to become narrower. So chronic bronchitis, damage and obstruction of airways. So now let's talk about emphysema. So emphysema, the signs and symptoms for this is you cough out blood, there's shortness of breath and wheezing. This is because your surface area to volume ratio is becoming decreased for gas exchange. So we'll come to how it gets decreased. So we also know that the volume of air that the person breathes out is lower, and there's also an increased rate of breathing and also higher blood pressure. So what happens is the inflammations of the constantly infected lungs, it causes the phagocytes, and phagocytes are a type of white blood cells. So we'll talk about that more in the immune system chapter, but just know that phagocytes are a type of white blood cells. So it causes phagocytes to leave the blood capillaries and to line the airways. And for the alveoli to reach the lining, it must release this protein digesting enzyme called elastase. It digests elastin, and we know that elastin is involved in giving alveoli its elastic features, right? So they digest elastin in the elastic alveolar walls to make a path for the phagocytes. So elastin is required for the stretch and recoil during inspiration and expiration. So the damaged alveolar walls do not stretch and recoil. So basically what will happen is when during the next inspiration expiration, it will cause the bronchioles to collapse. The air will be trapped in the alveoli, which will also often burst. So over time, your bronchioles are being destroyed, your alveoli are being destroyed. So there's large air spaces left where alveoli used to be, This all of this basically reduces your surface area to volume ratio for gas exchange, because you need to know that gas exchange only occurs on the alveoli. So eventually it results in inefficient gas exchange, meaning there's gas exchange still being taken place, but it's way slower. And the loss of capillaries leads to lower oxygenation of the blood. So there's also an increased respiratory rate. So we know that increased breathing rate is a symptom. Consequently, the muscular walls of the right ventricle become thicker, because you need to increase the amount of times blood needs to go to the lungs for oxygenation to take place. So lung cancer. So we already talked about cancer under one of the previous chapters. So the symptoms of this is usually coughing blood, and this is also because of tar, because tar contains carcinogens, and we know carcinogens are cancer-causing agents. So they react directly or via breakdown of products with the DNA, and if they react with the DNA, which causes a change in gene structure, and usually it's a spontaneous change, and a spontaneous change in gene structure, we know that it's known as a mutation, and this can result in something which we know as an oncogene. And oncogenes are what cause cancer, so it can result in uncontrolled cell division, leading to the formation of a tumor. And we also know metastasis is when cancer can spread to the rest of the body. So it can enter the lymphatic, for example, and then it will spread to the lymph system. So that's on cancer. Okay, so now, so there's a mistake on the headings. This is a question and answer segment. So now let's answer a few questions. So the table shows the partial pressure of carbon dioxide and oxygen in two blood vessels. So what explains the difference in the partial pressures of oxygen in the pulmonary artery and pulmonary vein? So we can see here that the partial pressure of gas in the pulmonary artery is 6, of carbon dioxide is 6 and oxygen is 5, and of the vein, carbon dioxide is 5 and oxygen is 15. So the partial pressure of oxygen in the vein is much greater, right? So I'm trying to recall what does the pulmonary artery do and what does the pulmonary vein do. So we know that the pulmonary artery will bring blood from the heart to the lungs, and vein will carry it away and take back the oxygenated blood. So what happens during gas exchange at the alveoli? We know that there's a higher oxygen concentration in the alveolar cavity, so oxygen will be diffusing through the alveolar cavity into the blood plasma and into the so the option should be A, because carbon dioxide will be diffusing out while the oxygen will be diffusing into the blood plasma. So this is by concentration gradients, and then the blood is carried to the lungs in the pulmonary artery and away by the pulmonary vein. So yeah, so the answer is A. So the next part is, which graph shows the effect of carbon monoxide on the percentage saturation of hemoglobin with oxygen? So I'll let you read the graphs and just try to think of this answer by yourself, and then I'll explain. Okay, so we know that carbon monoxide can bind with hemoglobin to form this stable compound, which we know as carboxyhemoglobin. And carboxyhemoglobin reduces the hemoglobin oxygen carrying capacity. And if it reduces the oxygen carrying capacity, it means that the percentage saturation, meaning how much of hemoglobin is saturated with oxygen, will be much lower. So out of all the graphs, only this one with carbon monoxide, so this graph is way lower than the one without carbon monoxide. So the answer should be A. And okay, so let's talk about this. How many times must a molecule of carbon dioxide pass through the cell surface membrane as it diffuses from the blood plasma through a cell in the capillary wall into the alveolus? So basically, the carbon dioxide will have to pass through the endothelium of the blood capillary, and then have to pass through the alveoli. So if you just take into thought that it will pass through one cell in the endothelium and one cell in the alveoli. So in one cell, there's you'll have to cross one cell surface membrane, and then to enter that cell and then to leave it, there'll be two. So per cell, it crosses two cell surface membranes. So the answer should be D, which is 4. And next question is about the distribution of tissues. So which row shows the tissues that are present in the wall of the trachea and in the wall of the bronchus? So trachea and bronchus, they both have cartilage, we know that, and they both have goblet cells because they need to produce mucus and secrete mucus to trap the foreign particles. And this term, squamous epithelium, so we have heard this term before, and that was when we described the structure of the capillary. I mean, not the capillary, sorry, the alveoli, because the alveoli has a one cell thick squamous epithelium layer. So the answer should be C, because squamous epithelium is only present in alveoli, not in trachea or bronchus. So the answer should be C. Okay, so this is also about distribution of tissues. So this is about terminal bronchioles. So terminal bronchioles are the final bronchioles which supply air to the alveoli. So after the bronchus divides, it forms smaller bronchioles, and it forms terminal and then respiratory bronchioles. So yeah, so this is one of the final subdivisions of the bronchioles. So what will be present? So we know that cartilage is only present in trachea and bronchi. So A and B is definitely wrong. And we know that cilia is present and smooth muscle is present. Smooth muscle must be present because it can contract to control the airflow into the alveoli. So smooth muscle must be present. So D is wrong. And cilia is present in both respiratory and terminal bronchioles, but in respiratory bronchioles is much lesser. So that'll be everything for the gas exchange chapter. So this is a very simple chapter. You just need to remember a few details, and everything else is quite straightforward. So I hope you understood this lesson. If you have any questions, leave them in the comment section. If you have any suggestions, leave them there, and I'll try to get back to you as soon as possible. I hope this lesson was useful. If you find it useful, do consider liking and subscribing, and you could consider sharing with your friends so more people can benefit. And all right, I'll see you in the next lesson. Thank you, goodbye, and have a great time studying bio.